welcome to Hammer Throw, the essentials, and this time we're talking about the turns. Well, there we go, the recording is definitely on now. So yeah, the hammer turns, this is obviously an extension of the last webinar, which was about the entry, and so there will be a little bit about that, but in particular what I want to look at is something called the linear drive in the rotational event, and hopefully we'll make that clear what it is and how you use it as a go through. So this is the agenda for this evening. Obviously a brief introduction, aims and objectives, a quick recap as I suggested, that's of the underlying ethos of the throw, the athletic posture which we went through during the presentation on the entry. And then we'll look at the stages of a good turn. These are not definitive, they're just the easiest ones to identify often, but I'll talk about that as we go through. And then actually what is the linear drive in the hammer, and then we'll look at it in terms of the progressions through each of the turns. And at the end of this I've got 3 videos for you to view, one of Koji Murafushi, which is a really nice video taken from the side and from the back, which gives a great comparison on positions throughout the throw. It's also used throughout the rest of the presentation, as you'll see. And then actually I've got a couple of videos of a beginner, Lexi Ellis, who is one of Nick's athletes, and what I want to show is the difference between those, but also actually how in the work that Nick's done with her, the difference that he's been able to make towards the changes that we're talking about here in this session. So a quick introduction of me. I won't labour that, you've seen it before if you were on in the previous one. Obviously I was mainly a discus thrower, but I have coached a lot of people in all the heavy throws, never the light long distance one called javelin, but mainly in the heavy throws. And I have over more recent years spent a lot more time coaching hammer. Lucy Marshall being obviously one of my main athletes in the hammer, albeit there have been others along the way. Craig, who's online as well, I coached some time ago. So the aims and objectives of the session then, to review an understanding of the underlying ethos. So we will look at that again, and it's really important to understand, so important, that's why I want to repeat it. We will look at the good posture again and how that fits throughout the throw. Trying to understand what these stages of a turn are, what they are and what they're not actually, because although these are relevant points in the throw, there is a serious threat of them becoming too fixed in a way, but I'll talk more about that when we get there. And then, as I said, understanding the concept of linear drive in the hammer, which can be seen a bit difficult when you've got a hammer spinning around the athlete, but actually, especially in the men's event, probably more so than the women's in some ways, the linear drive part of it is really important in terms of acceleration. So then again, we will look at the full turns and we'll then review those videos. So the underlying ethos, simple really. I mean, the honest answer to this is just think speed. The fact is that the 2 main elements that affect the distance of a throw are the angle of release and the speed of release. And pretty much angle of release everybody can get right most of the time. Yeah, we may argue about direction, particularly in the hammer, but actually the angle of release is relatively easy to achieve. It's the hammer speed, the actual release speed of the ball, that matters most, not necessarily the speed of rotation, because without the width of the rotation, the orbit, then that can be much less than it appears. And given that events, especially major championships, can be won by centimetres, it really does matter as to how much of an orbit you can create. And a large part of what we're going to talk about is how we create that orbit and the acceleration that's needed to achieve the speed. And say at the bottom there, release speed wins competitions. It is that simple. So if we also look then back at the athletic posture, this was a frame that I used previously. The athletic posture is how we hold the body during the course of the throw. It is not what some people seem to think it is, which is something similar to a back squat position, because actually the weight here is back. It's back towards the heels. You can see in the position that's being demonstrated by Tor here that his shoulders are very much over his heels. If you were to look at this in terms of a weightlifting exercise, then it would be much more akin to a front squat where the bar's held across the front of the shoulders, not one where it's across the back. So the weight's very evenly between the feet, hips are forward, shoulders above the hips, so the back is pretty much vertical. The upper body's relaxed but held in position. I mean, that's why we do so much work on core stability at the end of the day. It's not so that we can hold it tight, but we can hold it in position while staying relaxed. The shoulders are level, parallel to the ground, and the head is very much central with the neck relaxed, which is essential. There is a reflex in the neck that actually if your neck's tight, it's going to tighten up the whole of your body. And that certainly is going to make moving with any level of speed much more difficult. So what does that look like if we look at it in terms of a thrower? So here is Koji. This is from the video that we will look at in a while. And what we're looking at is those positions. This is the toe turn. So I've taken a look at it both in terms of the toe turn and the heel turn here because the position is slightly different. So in a toe turn, you tend to see that the body is angled slightly further forwards. You can see in the top item there, the top picture, that he's leaning forwards. His shoulders are still behind his heel, actually, of his left foot. And obviously he's a right-handed thrower, so he's turning on his left foot. But what you will see is that actually the effect of that is still pretty much to drive backwards into the direction of circle, the direction of throw. And we'll talk more about that in a while. But part of the reason for that is the arrow along his foot. Obviously, when he's turning on the toe or the ball, the inside of the foot is often the best way to do this. Then actually there is a force that's being created back in that direction. So that adds in effect to the balance position, which is why it's necessary for him to lean slightly further forward. If we go on to the heel turn, then actually you see that he's much closer to that position that was being demonstrated, and that now in fact the back is almost vertical. His weight is sitting very much behind his heel, and that will result in him moving directly back across the circle in the direction of throw. The very important point about where the hammer is right now, but that's for a little later on too. So there's a much more upright posture here. The hammer's out in front of him, and in fact the hammer is balancing that position. Obviously if you took the hammer out here, he would just fall on his back, and that's another important point about the positions throughout this. They are dynamic positions, they are balanced by the hammer, and without that balance you would lose the position and fall over. And if any of you have watched the few YouTube videos where a hammer has become separated during a turn, yeah, the throwers can end up in all sorts of difficulty and surprisingly far out of the circle in some cases. So what are the stages of a good turn? Well, these are all pretty standard really, and I'm starting here with the low point, although one could argue that I should in fact start with the catch. But given that this is about how we move from the entry into those turns, I've chosen this way round, but I'll explain a little bit more about that as I go through. The low point is obvious. It's the point during the orbit where the hammer is at its lowest. I would have liked to have been able to get that picture just one frame further on. Unfortunately, the camera video, when you move it one frame on, moves past the low point. But in terms of what you're looking at of Koji there, It's a very strong position. Both his hips are back. He's sitting nicely on the ball, which we saw from the previous frame, but also the hammer is right out in front of him where the low point is arriving. The wide point is the one where you're over your left foot, and we're trying to get the ball out as far, obviously we're a right-handed thrower, as far to the left as possible to create the width in the throw, the width in the orbit. The high point is during the single support phase, and as I said, please don't take any of these. We can argue where the single support starts, stops and all of that thing. It's not really about that. This is about just trying to denote some areas of the throw which are easy to look at. They're not precise. They will change for each individual thrower. This is more a question of style really than technique, but these points will exist somewhere within any good technique. The catch is quite an obvious one. You know, it is the point at which the right foot comes down, the ball is caught in effect, the tension is there in the body, and it's really important that that tension starts immediately the foot comes down. That it should never really be loose. If ever the hammer is flying freely, then there's a lack of connection, and that will result in a loss of acceleration too. But most importantly, as I say there, this is the start of the next turn. I think, you know, when I'm watching throwers competing, quite often what I see is a tendency for throwers to treat this as the end of the turn. And the trouble with that is that they then tend to move through this position before they start the next turn. And that results in a delay in them activating properly. And that means, again, there's a loss of acceleration. So if we look at each of those points in turn, the low point, sometimes called the transition phase, or somewhere between this and the wide point, actually is the transition. And it occurs at that low point of the orbit. It's approximately 180 degrees from the direction of throw. That's what DOT stands for those who are wondering. The hammer's very much in a neutral position, and by that I mean if you look where Koji's shoulders are, his arms are out in front of him. There's a nice isosceles triangle there, and so his arms are both looking out at the same sort of length, and the hammer's directly out in front of him. And certainly if I could go between this and the next frame of this video, then you would see that even better. So everything, if in effect, in his body is looking at the hammer. And very importantly, that is looking directly away from the direction of throw. His head's very neutral. In some cases, very advanced throws, you will see them actually looking behind the hammer. What we tend to see more often in beginners is that by this point, they'll already be looking over their left shoulder somewhere, looking to get into the throw far too early. And that has a whole number of effects that I will talk about later in the presentation. The weight's very much balanced between the feet. I'm guessing at this point he would probably feel that he had more pressure on his left foot. But you'll notice he's not trying to turn, he's not trying to twist, he's not pushing the right in and getting out of position. He's being very patient here, and that allows him to transition into the turn very effectively. So here we go, out to the wide point. His right foot's just come off the ground, and essentially the hammer's now pointing around about 90 degrees away from the direction of throw. The hammer's still very much in a neutral position. His hips, if you look at a line through his hips and the line through his shoulders, they would be very much parallel in every sense. And again, perpendicular to the hammer. So he's achieving the maximum possible width that he can in this position. Again, this is the toe turn, so it's probably slightly further back in some cases than the rest of the throw, but we will look at that progression too. His head's still in neutral, his hips are forward and his arms are out. But the key to note here, if you look at an angle between his body, he's got that nice white stripe down the side which makes it easy, and his arms are actually only just over 90 degrees at this point. And in fact, if you were one frame further on, they would be less than 90 degrees, as we'll see in a minute. And that's actually quite important too. Quite often at this position, we'll see beginner throwers who are lifting the hammer and their hands would be up well in front of their face, if not even above head height in some cases. So here at this point is the high point. One could argue the high point might happen a fraction later, but in reality, this is where it matters right now. The hammer's pointing around 45 degrees from the direction of throw, somewhere outside the right sector line, obviously. The arm's still extended, his shoulders are still very much pointed towards the hammer, so he's got the maximum length of that chain right from the ball through his hands into his shoulders that he can achieve. His right knee has been driven up towards the hammer and his foot stayed close to his left shin, which allows him then to begin to what we call sit on the hammer, to hang in on the hammer or ride the hammer. His hips are just beginning to overtake because he's going to need that in a moment, ready to catch the hammer in the catch position. But he's not rushing to do that. You see that throughout this phase between this particular stage and the next, there is a really quite passive phase of the throw where the hammer thrower should just be hanging on to the hammer. Let it take you round. I think I've said before, it's something that, in fact, I think Sean Pickering mentioned it. It's a battle, this, between the hammer thrower and the ball, but it's a battle that you don't want to win. You don't want to lose either, but it's all about staying well balanced. So here's the catch. Now in this case, because it's his first turn in particular, Koji is landing on the heel of his right foot. So it's well worth noting that actually helps him keep his weight back. It's the beginning of the next turn. It really is the start of the next turn and the next turn and the next turn, not the end of the previous one. So as soon as he's down, he's on his heel here. This is actually allowing him to move more quickly into the next phase that he wants to get into, the drive into the next turn. The hammer's still in neutral, relatively speaking. His hips are slightly ahead here, we can see that, but we will see how he deals with that when we go through the progressions. The weight's balanced much more towards the left foot now. If you look where his hips, his left hip in particular, if you look through a line through that, it's very much closer to his left foot. So as though he's on the toe of his left foot and the heel of his right, his body weight is actually sitting well back towards his left side. And what's really important, as I mentioned a moment ago, is that the hammer is fully extended and it's engaged. And when I say engaged, what I mean is that the thrower can feel it. It's pulling, it's out there, it's all the way through. There is no sense of it being loose. If you look at the line through the hammer, you can just see the ball there, just sitting outside of the left sector. There is a very fixed line between that and a very straight line, straight through the hammer wire, up through that and through his arms into his shoulders. Again, if you see any deviation in that at this point, it's going to cause quite a significant loss of acceleration in the throw. So, linear drive, what is it? Well, as I said earlier, it occurs very much at the low point during the transition into the next turn. In the frames that you can see here, it is caused by the body position as much as anything. It's not necessarily about extending the legs, although sometimes that can be used too. And if you did extend the legs, it's very much about extending them backwards. But in fact, the aim is to create a drive across the circle in the direction of throw. This causes the ball to have to turn and to move and to accelerate in a very significant way. It absolutely requires good posture. If you look at the position that Koji is holding here, it's a very strong position, and it's something you need a significant amount of core strength to be able to do it. So it's not always something that beginners can achieve very easily, unless of course you are sensible and keep the weight down for beginners. It's another good reason for building up from lighter weights rather than trying to build strength necessarily through throwing heavier weights early on. The actual acceleration feels like a whoosh it's almost like the body's dropping backwards and the hammer is almost taking off on its own. And that in a sense can create a difficulty, because what we see sometimes is that athletes get this position once, the hammer takes off, they catch up, and then actually they don't quite make it through to the next phase, through to the catch, through the high point into the catch. They're so used to having to lead the hammer that when the hammer takes off on its own, it actually creates a moment of instability that they find very difficult to cope with. In a sense, this is all about controlled imbalance. It's about allowing yourself to get out of balance, but in a very controlled sort of way, and then having the confidence really to know that you're going to be able to hang on to the hammer, get through where you need to be, and re-establish that balance at the point of the catch. So it's created by the positions of the body. You can see that the body weight here is sitting well back behind Koji's left foot, and his knee bend results in a drive that goes through the hips and then out directly in the line of the throw. No matter whether you look at it from the front, you look at it from the side, you can see absolutely where that's going. And key to this, it does a couple of things. There's the position of the hammer. And if you look at the bottom frame, you can see very clearly that the hammer is absolutely facing towards the camera. One could argue he's perhaps got his weight a little bit on the right side there, but I'll not argue about it too much because it's a very good throw. But that is where the direction of throw is. And in fact, if the hammer's at this point and the hips are twisted, almost inevitably the hammer will end up going off in a different direction. So it's essential that the drive is across the circle, but also essential that the body and the hammer are lined up at that point and going in the direction that you want the hammer to go out in the throw. So if we look at the development of the drive in the low point throughout the turns, here's the position that we've similar to where we've just seen. It's the one just a frame too earlier, a turn earlier. This is the entry, and Koji's sitting very much in that position again. His back is absolutely facing the direction of throw. The hammer's out in front of him. And if we watch that develop as we go through the turns, there's the position that we were just looking at. Turn 3 and turn 4. You can see how similar they look. Yep, he's getting marginally further ahead of the ball on each time, but that's not surprising. It's a necessary part of turning and accelerating the ball throughout all 4 turns. So he's having to anticipate ever so slightly. But look at how slight that is. The actual twist in his hips and his feet is very slight. Actually, he's still trying to keep his shoulders facing very much towards the back of the circle. And certainly in turn 4 there, you can see, well, in turn 3 too, yeah, the ball is absolutely facing 180 degrees in the direction of throw. And that results in the delivery position here. Again, it's one of those where I'd have loved to have been able to show you just a fraction of a second earlier, and the video didn't quite allow that. But I think you can see even now he's only just beginning to turn away from the direction of throw, even though the ball's gone through that point already. So this point about facing the back of the circle, the low point occurring around about there, it may move slightly across from the thrower's right to their left. But if the ball is outside of the left foot by any distance, particularly by the fourth or the delivery phase, then actually the ball is going to be lost, and it's probably going to result not only in a slower throw, but a thrower outside of the sector or in the cage. So we look there absolutely, just to reiterate, the drive through each of these is absolutely out and straight down the middle of the sector. Looking at it from the side, direct comparison here, you can see those positions again, straight through the circle and straight out in the direction of throw. I guess the thing that's most noticeable here is that he is rising up slowly throughout the turn, but it's not within each turn. It's just a gentle progression through each turn as the hammer gains momentum, and actually it effectively pulls him out into that position. So the wide point as we progress through each turn is the beginning, the toe turn, turn 2, which for Koji obviously now is a heel turn, turn 3, and turn 4. And obviously there's no corresponding for the delivery on this, but you can see again how similar those positions were, and if the video frame rate were much higher, I'm sure you'd be able to get into very similar positions. You'll notice here what I talked about between turn 1 and into turn 2, turn 3, and it's perhaps a little exaggerated on this particular image of turn 4, but is the angle of the arms compared to his back. And you'll notice that actually in effect his arms, the angle between his back and his arms is decreasing. So it's coming down from over 90 degrees in turn 1 to around 90 in turn 2, less than 90 in turn 3, and significantly less in turn 4. And why is that? Well, the thing to look at here is where his hips are. If you look at and see that his shoulders are still pretty much down the center of the circle all of the time, but look at the difference in his hips, how far back they are in turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, these hips are forward, and in turn 4, his body's almost in a straight line. So that allows him to be in a much stronger position. It balances the building momentum of the ball and keeps him in a strong position. And the reason I say a strong position is not so he can bully the ball. It's exactly the opposite. By being in a strong position, maximizing the radius boosts his speed. But it also means that he doesn't have to try too hard to hold that position. It's much easier to hold the ball and stay relaxed when your arms are in that position than it is if they get up and above your shoulder height. So here, actually at the high point, same again. You can see now those points, how it's building throughout the throw from the width of the throw right through into the high point. He's getting slightly further ahead. You can see by turn 4 his hips are now facing almost at 90 degrees to the direction of throw, while the ball's actually out in the direction of throw. So the high point, very important. Again, it's going to be almost on the direction of throw. But what's happening at this point is that he is able to sit on that hammer. The hammer's pulling him out, and it is doing a lot of the work now. This allows him to move his hips underneath the hammer, get his feet under the hammer and prepare for the catch. And by preparing for the catch in this way, by being relaxed at this point, he can accelerate into the catch position. So here, and I've used now the comparisons directly, so apologies if the images are a little smaller, but hopefully there's a benefit here in seeing it both from the side and from the back. And here, obviously, actually it's turn 2, 3, because I'm talking about this as the beginning of the turn. As I said, you could treat turn 2 as the end of turn 1. I much prefer to look at it as the beginning of the next turn. And again into delivery. So turn 2, 3, 4, and then finally into the delivery. And again, what we notice is that each time he's getting slightly further ahead. He's having to move a little bit quicker. He's trying to stay relaxed, and he's keeping the length of the ball. If you look at the delivery catch, absolutely, he is got the ball out as far as it can go in that direction. His weight is now absolutely planted above his left foot. His right foot is effectively just acting as a paddle to drive him around the turn and into the throw. You can see from the side view he's leaning away from it, but actually not leaning a long way away from it. Okay, this is not a position that he's having to counter. He's allowed the ball to pull him up, and this is why the riding on the hammer, the hanging in the hammer or hanging on the hammer is so important. It allows you to get into a much more powerful position from which the ball can be delivered into the throw. But it's very important to point out here, you know, these are digital positions. They're fixed positions in what is, as I said earlier, a dynamic throw. And you could do all of these positions perfectly, but without rhythm, they might not necessarily result in a good throw. All good throws require a good rhythm, and that's regardless of whether it's hammer, shot, discus, or javelin. You know, there has to be a rhythm in which the ball is accelerating for hammer, and you see that by the way in which the orbit increases over the period of the 4 throws, and we will look at that in the videos in a short while. So here we go. The first video. This is a video, and it's filmed by and with the kind permission to be used of Sean Pickering. Obviously the film was taken with the permission of Koji at the time as well. And it's an 80-meter plus training throw, I think from around 2012, 2014, if I remember rightly on what they said. So this is a big throw. This is no small throw. This is no small technical effort to make it look good. This is a good throw that goes a long way. And I think that's really important to understand. So let's have a look at this. So I'll let it play through a couple of times, and then we'll come back and actually try and look at those points together. So it may be a little bit jumpy to start with. Okay, maybe just try it one more time. Okay, so hopefully you had the opportunity to see that. It was a bit jumpy on mine, but I'm not sure if that was down to my connection. So if I just jump back in the throw. Here we go. So here's the wind up. The ball is kept very long in the wind up, notice, and the arms are very much extended and out away from him. He keeps his arms in close as he comes around, as we talked about in the entry in the previous webinar. And as he begins to move into was essentially something equivalent of the catch position here, you'll notice that he keeps his right hip back. He fixes his left side, and there we go. That's it. Oh, there we go. One more to just come back one frame. Actually, that's a good position. So here's the entry. At this point, he's beginning to think about the drive, and that would be where the drive would be, directly across the circle. And that then accelerates the ball out to the wide point, giving him as much width on the orbit as he can achieve. It's the toe turn, clearly, so his weight is very much over the toe. The point of rotation here very much in the center of his shoulder, actually, as you look at it from the side, whereas a heel turn, it will be a little bit more at the back of the shoulder, the left shoulder. Again, he's picked up the ball very early. You can see that his arms are very well out. They're very long. His position in terms of the angle of the body and the angle of the arms, again, that's that nice 90-degree angle the ball sitting almost level with his shoulders at this point. You can see that he's landed on his right heel, as I mentioned earlier, so much so that in fact his toes pulling off the ground, which gives you a good indication of the fact that his weight actually is sitting right back towards his left foot. And as he progresses through the throw, essentially those same positions repeat. Again, the body very upright in this position. Unfortunately, the video is jumping a little bit more than I would hope for. Must be a slow connection or something today. But his back very much in a vertical position throughout a lot of the throw. Coming into the release. There we go. Even now his back is almost vertical, and he's driving out in the direction of throw when the ball comes through the low point. I'll just take that back one more. There he is, he's driving through as the ball comes through the low point, driving out in the direction of throw. His arms here still up at that point, the one frame there, still below his shoulder height if you go through the line of his back, and it's not until actually as he releases that his arms come up and away from his body into that slightly weaker position. I think one of the really interesting things about this too, not only the rhythm, but we'll just try and let it play through here again. If you watch where his feet go, that actually not only is he driving with his back in the direction of throw, you can see very clearly that his feet follow the line of throw. So that's a sign of a thrower in good form, and sometimes you might see them arc a little bit out to the right as we look at the camera from the camera angle, and sometimes you see throwers who are starting further across to the left as we look at it, across to his right. But usually that's because of issues, there are faults, there are difficulties, can be injuries, it can be just age in some cases. As throwers get a little older, they get a little slower, but they get more technically gifted, so actually they can make up. But what they struggle to make up at times is for the speed. So certainly one area that Koji himself was able to maintain very well throughout his long career. And so as a consequence, what you see with that drive, that linear drive straight down the middle of the sector, is his feet follow that line very clearly. There is no loss of the energy in the ball. It just keeps building throughout the throw. And if you watch the throw, you can see how it gets bigger and bigger right through into the delivery. Each time the ball is climbing a little higher, it's going up, it's getting the orbit has the feel, although I think if you measured it, it'd probably be debatable whether it actually was, but it has the feel of getting wider and wider as he goes throughout the throw. There we go. Okay, so what I want to do is compare that now with a beginner. Quite often when we do these sorts of presentations and are looking at analysis of throws, it's very easy to look at other throwers, technically the most gifted throwers, and they actually can, yeah, I mean, obviously they're a great model, but in reality, what it often doesn't show us is where those things go wrong specifically for beginning throwers. So we're going to look now at development of a beginner thrower, and Lexi again has given us permission to use these videos. I appreciate it very much. and I'm very pleased to see the progress that she's made, which I hope we'll highlight in the two videos that we're about to look at. You see Lexi is age 14. She's coached by Nick, and she has a PB of 23.40, but you know, what's good is we're now seeing that, or Nick is seeing that the throws are getting out to around 34 meters on a regular basis, and generally practicing with 3 turns, but sometimes 2, I think, if it's necessary for essentially for technical development reasons. And it's really important to understand that actually going for a 2-turn throw, if that's the right, to keep the technique right, is absolutely the right thing to do. Unfortunately, on many occasions, I've been at athletics events and heard coaches saying to athletes throwing off less than 3, or in fact actually often on less than 4 turns, you know, oh, you should be doing this number of turns. But the reality is you need to do the number of turns that allow you to A, keep a technique, and B, throw the furthest at that point in time. There is no point in throwing off 4 turns if it doesn't throw any further, or in some cases throws less and is less predictable than when throwing off 2 turns, for instance. So here, if we just try and look at Lexi's throw, and what I want you to look for in this in particular is the direction of throw. Look for where the hammer is about to go, and then we'll try and identify specifically afterwards why that happens. Try that again. Okay. Again, we seem to be having a little bit of difficulty with the video here, so it's working very well earlier on. It may be just down to the number of people online, I guess, in general. But there we go. And what happens, you can see from where Lex is looking at the end here, is that the ball ends up going well off to the left-hand side, and I guess that would be out of the sector. So actually, if we look at why that is and how it fits into the model that we've been talking about here. So the wind up comes through. Let's just try and get it to move. Okay, so apologies, this is not running through as well as I would hope. Ah, there we go. Actually, we had the position there for a moment. Let's try and get it back again. There it is. That'll do. That'll do. I don't know if you see the big start button here, but that does tend to get in the way a little bit. See if we can't make that a little less opaque. So here the ball is pointing directly at the camera, which obviously is pointing through the circle and in the direction of throw. But if you look at it at this point and compare that with what we were looking at with Koji, and this is the second turn, I think, at this particular point. At this point, Koji would have been facing the camera too. His hips would have been facing the camera, and actually the ball would look very much more like it's coming out down his right leg rather here than you can see it lined up more with the left leg. So although the ball is currently facing in the direction, 180 degrees in the direction of throw, Lexi's hips are pointing outside the left-hand sector, and that's where her drive is going at the moment. Essentially, it's going out to the left of the sector line, and it will cause the ball to be pulled around and outside that line, and obviously that would result in the end at either a throw that went out of the sector or possibly even into the cage door. So here as she begins to turn, she's trying to stay long. She already knows about trying to stay long, so that actually isn't a bad position. And she's picking a leg up well. He's driving a knee through, and actually is holding on to the ball pretty well at this stage. But unfortunately, it's that turn, that initial turn, that set this whole thing up to mean that the hammer's going to go out to the left-hand side in a while. What we often see too here is this is the point actually where, if you remember in Koji's throw, he was ahead of the ball slightly at this point, and you see that actually Lexi is already slightly behind it with the hips, or at least on it. So at the point when the hips come down, that's where we need to be ahead, not then turning, trying to catch up and stay ahead of it throughout the turn. So here we go again. Now that, if we look here, that's the position now in terms of her legs, where we see that the hips, the legs are all actually facing out in the direction of the throw. And if she held that position at this point and allowed the ball to travel across to our right, as we're looking at towards her left, towards the wide point, then actually that would increase not only the width of the throw, but it would increase the acceleration in the throw, and obviously take it out in the direction that she would rather it went. But by the time the ball gets where she wants it to be, again, the hips are well out down the left-hand side. Again, really good pickup. The arms are down, she's not overlifting. The catch actually there is pretty good. She's ahead of it. That's nice. But now she's ahead of the ball quite a long way. So as the ball comes through the low point, she's facing out down the left, and then actually out into the delivery. And we will see that she, in fact, hooks it, and away it goes off up to the left-hand side. So that's as it was. Now I know Nick worked on this with Lexi and actually tried to get the ball out in front of her more, especially between the low point and the wide point, out on our right, her left. And actually this is the throw that's come from a month or so later. There we go. And now you'll see that in fact she goes off, if anything, slightly to the right, and that's fine. You know, this is about trying to make progress, and often when we make progress, then the tendency is to go off in the opposite direction to start with. Absolutely fine. Much better to be out here. You've watched just like we did with Koji. We'll see that her feet are now traveling down the center line of the circle, either side of the center line. And she finishes in a much stronger position. The hammer actually ends up just slightly left of centre, but I think, to be honest, that was more to do with on the very last turn, she actually does snatch at it a little bit. But the first two turns in this really are so much better. Let's just try and slow it down and have a look. Stop it. Okay, so if you bear in mind where we were with the previous video, and oh, it's gone past. Come back. There we go. Now actually that's not bad. Now look where the hammer, oh, gone again. And come back. A little bit more. There we go. So she is turning ever so slightly away, but actually it's much less now. You can see that direction is just slightly left of centre. The ball is beginning to overtake it, and actually she allows that to happen a lot more. And the weight then is pulled out to her left, over her left side, the right side as we look from the camera angle. There we go. You actually saw her move forward then. The ball pulled her in the direction that she wanted to go. And that means she can maintain her balance. Right as she's sitting on the hammer here, it's pointing again, perhaps just slightly left of centre. But it's such a massive improvement in terms of the position all the way through that she's able to sit on the hammer really nicely when she lands. Again, looking at the hammer much more. An interesting position here of the left leg, and actually we see this quite often with throwers. mainly, I have to say, with girls, but not exclusively, as I'm sure Craig would attest if he's still listening. And that I think this comes often from athletes trying to anticipate the turn, trying to get the heel or sorry, the twist of the leg into a position where they can get onto the heel, as opposed to putting the heel down and then turning. It's a little bit about maybe a slight anxiety in some cases, you know, the anxiousness of, oh, can I get in? Can I get in? I need to get going. Where actually it's just about being patient. Sit on the ball, let it run through, and allow it to pull you into the positions that you want. There we go. She's now got the heel down and knees now back in almost along her foot. So the reality of that is an awful lot better. Just see if I can catch the, I've just gone past the low point again. Try and bring it back. There we go. That's not bad again. It's driving out down the center of the throw, and in fact we allow that to finish again. She gets pulled out a little bit to the right and the hammer kicks off to the left, but it's only very marginal. So in terms of actually pushing the ball out to her left hand side into the wide point, you can see that there's been a significant amount of progress there. Okay, so just to review quickly then, essentially we've said to us again that hammer speed is the key here. That's what we're looking for, that's what we're trying to achieve, and that's helped hugely by having a really good athletic position, this position in which the hips are forward, the shoulders are relaxed and in the same plane as the hips as much as possible, and that allows us to maximize the rotational speed and orbit width. The four main stages of the throw that we've looked at, and as I said, although these are not gospel, you can move them a little bit one way or the other. They are there in the general sense in almost every throw. So you have the low point, the transition, where you're beginning to move into the next turn. The wide point, where you're trying to get the hammer out as far as you can for a left-hand side, for obviously for a right-handed thrower, and the opposite for a left-handed thrower. Then the high point, where you'll begin to ride on the ball, let the hammer do the work, get your hips forward and let the hammer balance you out. And then the catch, which is the beginning of the next turn. The linear drive in that low point transition phase is essential to gaining maximal speed, because that moves the point of rotation backwards across the circle, and that forces the hammer to have to catch up. And effectively that's what creates the extra acceleration that you don't get if you just spin around almost on the spot. Those positions progress throughout the throw, but actually during that you can view the system as a whole. You know, look at it all together. It reduces the stress in the system, and that again means that you can generate the maximum rotational speed. But as I said right at the end, all of that is totally dependent on putting each of those positions together with a good rhythm. And difficult as it is to show the rhythm in the video here, it really is an important aspect of the throw. It would be true to say that a slightly worse technique with a good rhythm is probably better than a perfect technique with a bad rhythm. Although one might argue to have a perfect technique, in truth, you need both. So that is the end of the presentation.